Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 114 called The Missing Link. In the last episode we heard how the Arabs met their Stalingrad before the walls of Constantinople in the cold winter of AD 717 to 718. It was a turning point in history and ensured the survival of a vibrant new empire, Byzantium. But the preceding century had witnessed the final collapse of the Roman Empire, and it had happened quickly. In less than 10 years from the triumph of Heraclius' victory over Persia in 628 to defeat at Yarmouk in 636, it went from being the greatest power in Western Eurasia to a small state struggling to survive. The cause was of course obvious. It was the astonishing rise of Islam, which overturned not just the Eastern Roman Empire, but the entire world order in 20 years. And I think it's pretty safe to say never in human history, either before or since, has such a dramatic reordering of the political status quo happened so quickly. But we have a problem. When I first looked at the rise of Islam many years ago, I was astonished to find both our sources and our understanding of it are woefully inadequate. Historians still struggle to explain why it happened. And in this episode, I want to explore something that is only just coming onto historians' radar screens, something that might be the missing link in explaining Islam's success. But before we get to that, let's start with why we have a problem understanding the Arab conquests. And the answer is we have almost no contemporary records, especially Islamic ones. As I mentioned in episode 107, our main contemporary literary source comes from the pen of an anonymous Armenian who some historians think was the Bishop Sabaeus, who does helpfully confirm the existence of Muhammad and his followers. Quote, "At that time, a certain man from among those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Muhammad, a merchant, as if by God's command, appeared to them as a preacher and taught them the path of truth. And he said to them, 'No one will be able to resist you in battle, because God is with you.'" End quote. Sabaeus provides us with an invaluable account of the Battle of Yarmouk and the fall of Sasanian Persia, but it's very brief, and the only detailed sources we have are Islamic ones, but they weren't written at the time. They were recorded about 2 centuries later during the Abbasid Caliphate by the likes of the famous Islamic chronicler al-Tabari, who lived from 839 to 923, who, although highly regarded as a historian, was writing so long after the event he had to rely on stories and myths handed down over the generations. It would be a bit like someone writing today about the American War of Independence from popular stories that have been told at campfires for generations. And the Islamic sources all suffer from one major disadvantage for the historian. They were written to praise God or Allah, not to explain how the events really happened. Although they provide us with quite detailed accounts of the campaigns and battles the early Arabs fought, the message is always the same. These early converts to Islam won victory after victory because of their piety and belief in one true God. So, how have historians interpreted this? Well, it's perhaps surprising, but we have an almost complete divide between Western scholars, with most Islamic specialists regarding the Islamic version of events with considerable skepticism. Some of them have even questioned the most basic tenets of the Islamic tradition, such as whether it originated in Mecca and whether the Arab conquests were religiously motivated. On the other hand, Roman scholars are generally more willing to accept that it was religious fervour that brought Islam's success. Now, in the rest of this episode, I want to put forward the counter-argument to the religious one. There's no doubt the early Islamic armies were motivated by some sort of religious ideology, even if this wasn't identical with the Islam we know today. But religious zeal is hard to quantify in military terms. Although we know that an army's morale is just as important as its equipment and training, we also know that religious fanaticism by itself doesn't guarantee success. For example, the religiously inspired Arab armies that attacked Constantinople in 717-718 were beaten by much smaller numbers of Byzantine defenders. And who's to say the Byzantines weren't just as religiously motivated as the Arabs? So we need to look elsewhere for our answer, and the first and most obvious reason for Arab success was the devastating and debilitating war between Rome and Persia from 602 to 628, which left them both exhausted. But while this was important, I don't think it was the entire answer, since despite the long Persian War, Heraclius could still field a large army at the Battle of Yarmouk, and the Persian Shah Yazdegerd III led a big army in 637, which defeated the Arabs at the Battle of the Bridge, before a second Arab army was mustered in Arabia and returned to defeat him at the Battle of Qadisiyah. The second most obvious reason was the Justinianic plague. As discussed in episode 109, both Rome and Persia may have lost around a third of their populations to the plague in its first and subsequent outbreaks. The literary sources support this view. But what about Arabia? The evidence is fairly certain that the plague never took hold there. As discussed in episode 109, the Arabs were shocked when they discovered it in Iraq. Therefore, the difference in demographic experience between Rome and Persia on one hand and Arabia on the other must have been enormous. So, the plague is an important differentiator. But there are plenty of others as well. The third lies with religion, but not religious fervour. One of the most important consequences of Islam, in my view, was the unification of the Arabian Peninsula into a single state for the first time in its history. As we discussed in episode 106, essential to Muhammad's vision was not only a new religion, but a new form of centralised state. Belief in Allah transcended the tribal and dynastic allegiances that had long dominated ancient Arabia, uniting the disparate tribes and ending the internecine warfare that had plagued Arabia for thousands of years was, in my opinion, Muhammad's greatest achievement. I see him as a sort of Arab Bismarck. Bismarck was the Prussian statesman who united Germany in the 19th century, turning what had been for 1,000 years a divided and largely powerless group of separate German states into the powerhouse of Europe. Another German comparison is with the consolidation among the Germanic tribes in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, which we covered a long time ago in episode 9. You may remember when Julius Caesar marched to the Rhine in the 1st century BC, he encountered an almost anarchic ancient Germania with around 300 different tribes that spent their time fighting each other. He saw no benefit in conquering them and left them to their own devices. But 200 years later, most of those tribes had combined to form supergroups, like the Goths, the Vandals, Alemanni and Franks. They were much more powerful, and this led to the crisis of the 3rd century. And we can say the same thing about Arabia in the 7th century. Suddenly, Rome and Persia were facing a united Arabia for the first time. There's a fourth reason, which is also to do with religion. This was the religious division within the Roman Empire between Monophysites and Chalcedonians, which we covered in episode 111. This was crippling the Roman Empire, in my view. I think this played into the hands of the advancing Arab armies. In Egypt, there's evidence the Coptic Church thought it might survive better under Islamic rule than under the hated rule of Chalcedonian Constantinople. And the Arabs were clever in manipulating this division to their advantage. For example, religious tolerance was a striking feature of their occupation of the conquered territories of the Roman Empire. They tolerated the Monophysites, who made up the majority of their populations for centuries to come, so that even today there's a very sizable Coptic Christian population in Egypt. In short, Islam gave the Arabs unity while Christianity divided the Romans. Now, I want to move on to the fifth and final reason, and this is the most fascinating of all because it's something that's only recently come to light. Now, historians don't normally make very good scientists, but as I've mentioned in past episodes, paleoclimatology, which is the analysis of climatic conditions in the past, is making huge strides and causing us to reevaluate our whole understanding of history. And it's particularly exciting in ancient and medieval history, where our records are so thin on the ground, and to be honest, we're very unlikely to discover any new hidden gems, like the writings of an unknown chronicler. So, as we discussed in episodes 109 and 110, scientific advances have enabled us to use tree rings, ice cores, stalactites, beryllium isotopes to analyse the climate thousands of years ago. Seen through the lens of climate history, new theories are developing about, for example, the Middle Ages, which in Europe went through the medieval warm phase between around 900 to 1200 AD, which boosted agricultural productivity, population growth and cultural development. Ultimately, this may have been what caused the Crusades, as larger populations led to bigger armies capable of conquering the Middle East. The end of these benign climatic conditions in the 14th century led to the Black Death, a time that has striking similarities with the late antique Little Ice Age. And while the late antique Little Ice Age is now universally recognised as being the most significant climatic event in human history since the last ice age, there's surprisingly little attention given to its historical significance, which is astonishing when you consider it coincided with some of the most momentous events in history, i.e. the rise of Islam and the demise of the ancient world. As we discussed in episode 109, paleoclimatologists now have a fairly good understanding of the impact of the unprecedented volcanic eruptions in the year 536 and the effect they had on Earth's temperature, probably lowering it by up to 3 degrees centigrade in most places, the largest change in temperature since the last ice age and twice the size of the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures caused today by global warming. Now, the latest research into this area is producing the most interesting results of all. In particular, the consequences for agriculture are more complex than previously thought and present a paradox that might help us understand one of the most important reasons for the rise of Islam. Indeed, I think it could be the missing link that has eluded us for so long. We discussed this in episode 110, and so let me quickly summarise it. We know from the literary evidence there were widespread geographical variations caused by the volcanic winter of 536 and the ensuing late antique Little Ice Age, even within the Roman Empire itself. For example, while Procopius records a horrific picture of harvest failure and starvation in central and northern Italy, there's evidence Sicily may have benefited from greater rainfall and delivered bumper wheat harvests. This was because, although it was colder everywhere, moisture accumulated more in mountainous areas, leading to increased rainfall. Another example is Anatolia, where more floods than normal were recorded during the late 530s and 540s when the climate was distinctly colder. Indeed, Anatolia seems to have been particularly wet, which favoured its wheat production, but conversely, more frosts than normal killed off many of its olive trees, which had been one of its farming staples. Indeed, one historian has recently conjectured this was a major reason why the Byzantine Empire survived in the 7th century and flourished in the 8th and 9th centuries, since its core territory in Anatolia became more productive at exactly the time it lost Egypt and the Levant to the Arabs, making the defeat at Yarmouk less damaging than has previously been thought. But what about Arabia? And here we are at the cutting edge of modern research, since it's only relatively recently that a research paper has been published suggesting the late antique Little Ice Age benefited Arabia, since its harsh, hot climate was almost certainly cooled by the fall in global temperatures, leading to increased rainfall. Increased rainfall would lead to increased vegetation, just as we know happened to the Sahara some 14,000 years ago when it became green, and which lasted until as recently as 5,000 years ago. And increased vegetation would lead to more to eat for everyone, from humans to livestock, and finally this would lead to population growth. So I suggest the ultimate reason for Arab success may have been a demographic divergence between Arabia and the populations of the Roman and Persian empires. While the Romans and Persians were suffering a double whammy of famine and plague caused by the falling global temperatures, the opposite happened in Arabia. The plague never found its way there, and the cooler temperatures led to more abundant agriculture. For millennia, the populations of the Levant, Egypt and Mesopotamia had greatly outnumbered those of Arabia. But suddenly, for the first time in history, this may have been reversed, and Arabia enjoyed population growth, which enabled large armies to be formed, perhaps larger than those of Rome and Persia. And the evidence for this lies with military history. I'm a big fan of military history, and the startling success of the Arab conquest, their victories at Yarmouk and Qadisiyah, have always left me puzzled. Why, for the first time in history, could the Arabs defeat the disciplined Roman army and the outstanding heavy cavalry and war elephants of the Persians, and do it with relative ease? We know their equipment was no better than the Roman and Persian. We think, although we don't actually know for sure, their main strike force was Bedouin horsemen who were highly skilled, but not more so than the famous Persian cataphracts and Heraclius's own Roman horsemen, who had proved so versatile and deadly in his campaigns against Persia. Surely the evidence suggests the Arab numbers were large. How else can we explain their defeat of both the Romans and Persians in quick succession, as well as their ability to absorb a major defeat at the Battle of the Bridge before bouncing back almost immediately with a strong new army which won the Battle of Qadisiyah? Was the true secret of Arab success that their resources of manpower were simply larger than those of the Romans and Persians? If so, I'm not at all surprised the Arab sources ignore this. Writing 200 years after the event, they probably had no idea about the relative size of the armies, and even if they did, they wouldn't have wanted to advertise an Arab advantage in numbers. Such a revelation would have undermined the heroic story of the first converts to Islam. It was far more convenient to present the Arab armies as outnumbered. In conclusion, I suggest the environmental explanation is the missing link that has eluded historians for so long in explaining the rise of Islam. It's the icing on the cake for the favourable situation the Arabs found themselves in the 7th century AD, when, for the first time in their history, Arabia was politically united, and at a moment when its population was growing due to a cooler climate and lack of plague. In contrast, Rome and Persia were suffering from famine, plague, religious division, and the effects of a long war. For centuries, the Romans and Persians had regarded the Arabs as little more than primitive nomads, quote, half-naked, clad in coloured cloaks down to the waist, as the Roman chronicler Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century AD had described them. But in the 7th century, the tables were turned. Arabia was the new powerhouse of the world. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I'm pleased to say we haven't reached the last episode of this podcast. The Roman Empire may be dead and replaced by the Byzantine Empire, but I want to continue into the era often called the Dark Ages. You might ask why I don't continue with the history of Byzantium. Well, the answer is that Byzantium was only one part of the Dark Ages, and I'd like to look at Western Eurasia from a broader standpoint than just the Byzantine one. As I see it, many of the people who inhabited the Dark Ages were really the inheritors of Rome, not just the Byzantines, but also the Franks. In AD 800, Charlemagne would be crowned in Rome as the new emperor of the West. And even in Islam, the ghost of the Roman Empire still influenced the caliphates. So for that reason, I'm not going to change the title of the podcast. I'm keeping it as The Fall of the Roman Empire. So let's embark on that journey, but not quite yet. As you know, these podcasts accompany a series of books I'm writing on the fall of the Roman Empire, and I'm working on the 5th volume, which I hope will be out in a few months. So let me update you in a month's time on the 17th of May on the timing for the next series. And if you have any views on whether you think I should or shouldn't continue with the Inheritors of Rome, please message me on my website, link in the show notes. And of course, if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.